If there's even a shred of truth to these stories about Jesus spending his lost years in India, studying with Buddhist monks, and possibly being buried in Kashmir, why don't we hear about it? Why isn't this taught in churches? Well, let's talk about the elephant in the room, the Vatican. The Vatican is not just some dusty old institution. It's one of the most powerful and secretive organizations in the world, with archives that stretch back thousands of years. And here's where it gets interesting. For centuries, people have whispered that the Vatican holds documents, ancient texts, and maybe even direct evidence that could rewrite the story of Jesus' life. There are claims that hidden deep in the Vatican archives, there are manuscripts that tell a different story, a story that includes Jesus' travels to the East, his time spent learning from spiritual masters in India, and even his life after the crucifixion. But here's the thing, getting access to those archives is next to impossible. Scholars can request to study specific documents, but only if they already know what they're looking for. The rest of the treasures in the archives? Off limits to the public. And that's where the questions start to pile up. Why would the Vatican suppress such information? Some believe it's all about maintaining control. If the traditional narrative about Jesus is challenged, if people start thinking he was influenced by Eastern religions or that he didn't die on the cross, it could shake the very foundations of Christianity. After all, the Church's teachings are built on the idea of Jesus' death and resurrection as the cornerstone of faith. Change that story, and you've got a massive theological problem on your hands. What if the Vatican isn't suppressing this information to keep people in the dark? What if they're actually trying to protect the legacy of Jesus? Think about it, if these alternative stories became mainstream, would they really help us understand Jesus better, or would they just create more confusion? Maybe, just maybe, the Church believes that the simple story we've been told of Jesus as the Son of God, who died for humanity's sins, is enough. Anything more would just complicate things. Still, there's something undeniably fascinating about the idea that the Church might be holding back explosive revelations about Jesus' life. Some theorists argue that over the centuries, various popes have known the truth but decided to keep it hidden, fearing it would undermine the faith of millions. Others say the Church is waiting for the right moment to release this information when humanity is ready for it. Let's also not forget about the political aspect. The Catholic Church has been a powerful institution for thousands of years. When you control the narrative of the most influential figure in human history, you control more than just religion, you control politics, power, and even culture. So, it's not surprising that they'd want to guard that narrative carefully. But here's the thing, in today's world, where information can be shared with a single tweet, more and more people are starting to question the traditional story. Scholars are digging deeper, independent researchers are exploring these alternative histories, and technology is allowing us to uncover ancient secrets like never before. The question is no longer whether there's more to the story of Jesus, it's about when we'll finally get the answers. Now, this isn't about blaming the Vatican or starting a conspiracy theory war. It's about asking the right questions and being open to the possibility that Jesus' life was more complex, more global, and more fascinating than we've been told. If there's one thing we've learned from history, it's that the truth has a way of coming out, no matter how deeply it's buried. We've all heard about Jesus' childhood, his birth in Bethlehem, the wise men, Herod, and so on. But then the Bible goes silent. For almost 18 years, there's nothing. No record, no details. It's as if he just disappears. The question is, where did he go? What if, during those so-called lost years, Jesus didn't stay in Nazareth? What if he embarked on a spiritual journey to the East, to India? Yeah, India. There's an ancient tradition, still held by people in India and Tibet, that Jesus, referred to as Saint Isa, traveled there as a young man to study with the mystics, the sages, and the monks. This isn't some random folk tale either. There are actual ancient manuscripts that talk about it. In 1887, a Russian explorer named Nicholas Notovich was traveling through the Himalayas. He stopped at a monastery in Ladakh, and there he found something incredible, a manuscript that told the story of Isa, a foreigner from the West who arrived in India, learned from the wise men, and became a great teacher. That Isa, according to the monks, was none other than Jesus, Yeah, that Jesus. Now, before you roll your eyes and think this sounds like some conspiracy theory, let's dive a little deeper. This isn't just some isolated myth. Multiple people, scholars, adventurers, and even local legends have backed this up. Notovich's findings were published in a book called The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, and it caused a huge uproar when it first came out. Some people dismissed it, but others? They were blown away. If Jesus really did travel to India during his youth, it would explain a lot. Like why his teaching seemed to echo Buddhist and Hindu philosophies, ideas about compassion, inner peace, and letting go of material desires. He wasn't just a carpenter's son with a knack for storytelling. He could have been a young man hungry for spiritual wisdom, someone who traveled thousands of miles to understand the world's greatest teachings and then brought them back to the West. Now, you're probably thinking, if this is true, why haven't we heard about it? Well, here's the kicker. The official story we know today, the one that's been passed down through church doctrine for centuries, only includes what the early church wanted us to know. Everything else? Forgotten, erased, or hidden away. And, to be fair, there's a reason for that. If the story of Jesus suddenly includes time spent in India, studying Buddhism, learning Sanskrit texts, it kind of shakes the foundation of what mainstream Christianity is built on, right? It challenges everything we thought we knew. You can almost imagine Jesus, a young man, barely in his 20s, making his way along the ancient Silk Road, passing through Persia, Afghanistan, and eventually reaching the monasteries of northern India. He's sitting at the feet of monks, learning about the nature of suffering, the path to enlightenment. He's asking questions, absorbing everything like a sponge. And then, after years of study, he returns to Judea with a new understanding of spirituality. And it doesn't stop there. This story continues to unfold in places you'd never expect. In Kashmir, India, there's a legend about a saint named Yusuf, believed to be the same Saint Isa. Some people even say there's a tomb in Srinagar where Yusuf is buried, a tomb that might hold the remains of Jesus. Yeah, a tomb in India. I know, it sounds insane. But this theory has been around for centuries, whispered in hushed tones, passed down through local stories. But where's the proof, right? Let's dig into something that really kicks this theory into overdrive, the manuscript. Back in the late 1800s, this Russian guy, Nicholas Notovich, decided to travel through the Himalayas. He wasn't just out for some spiritual adventure, he was on a serious mission, documenting cultures and religious practices. Then something pretty wild happened. He got injured along the way and had to take shelter at a Buddhist monastery in Ladakh. That's where things start to get really interesting. While he was recovering, Notovich claimed that the monks showed him an ancient manuscript, written in Tibetan, that detailed the life of a holy man named Isa. Now, here's the kicker. Isa was described as a foreigner, a man from the West, who came to India, learned their spiritual practices, and became a great teacher. Notovich, being a sharp guy, immediately made the connection, could this Isa be Jesus? So, here we are, in a remote monastery nestled in the Himalayas, and Notovich is sitting there with what might just be the missing piece of the puzzle. He's looking at a centuries-old text that says Jesus lived in India. Now, this is where things get controversial, because Notovich publishes his findings in The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, and, well, the academic world wasn't exactly thrilled. The church? Yeah, they weren't too happy either. But hold on, before we get into why people freaked out, let's break down what's actually in this manuscript. It talks about Isa's journey to India, his encounters with Hindu and Buddhist teachers, and how he began preaching a message of compassion and equality. It even describes how Isa opposed the rigid caste system in India, preaching that all humans are equal in the eyes of God. Sound familiar? Yeah, it's pretty similar to what Jesus preached back in Judea. But here's where it gets even crazier. Notovich wasn't the only one to come across this story. Other explorers and scholars in the region reported hearing the same legends. Swami Abhedananda, an Indian monk, also went to the Hemis monastery years later and claimed to have seen the same manuscript. And even more recently, Nicholas Roerich, a famous Russian painter and philosopher, mentioned hearing about Saint Isa in his travels through the Himalayas. Now, skeptics argue that this manuscript either never existed or was simply a local legend, exaggerated over time. They point out that after Notovich's discovery, no Western scholar could verify the manuscript's existence. In fact, some even accuse Notovich of making the whole thing up for fame. But here's the thing, the monks at Hemis have consistently maintained that the manuscript is real. They claim it's part of their ancient library, passed down through generations, though access to it is highly restricted. Now, we all know the core teachings of Jesus from the Gospels, right? Love your neighbor, turn the other cheek, live humbly, avoid materialism. But here's what's mind-blowing, a lot of those teachings sound eerily similar to Buddhist philosophy. We're talking about core ideas like compassion, non-attachment, humility, and even the parables that Jesus used to teach. These are all things that Buddhist monks had been teaching for hundreds of years before Jesus. Let's take compassion, for example. Jesus tells us to love our enemies, to forgive those who wrong us, to show mercy even when it's tough. Now, go back to Buddhist teachings. What's one of the main principles? Karuna, or compassion. Buddha taught that we should practice compassion for all living beings, regardless of how they treat us. Sounds pretty familiar, right? And what about materialism? Jesus made it clear that wealth and material possessions were not the path to the kingdom of God. In Matthew 19 verse 24, he says it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. Now, take a look at Buddhism. Buddha was all about renouncing worldly desires. He taught that attachment to material things leads to suffering, and that true happiness comes from inner peace, not wealth. Could this be a teaching that Jesus picked up while studying with monks in the East? Even the way Jesus taught, using parables to convey deeper spiritual truths, is a method that mirrors the way Buddhist monks taught their followers. In Buddhism, teaching through stories and metaphors is a common practice meant to guide people toward enlightenment without giving them all the answers outright. Jesus did the same thing. He didn't lecture people on theology or philosophy, he told stories about everyday life, about seeds, fishermen, and sheep, and let people figure out the deeper meaning themselves. Here's another intriguing point, Jesus' emphasis on the kingdom of God being within you. That phrase sounds very much like Buddhist and Hindu ideas about finding divinity or enlightenment within. Jesus wasn't just talking about some distant heaven in the sky, he was pointing people inward, toward their own spiritual journey. This aligns with the idea in Eastern philosophies that enlightenment is something you discover within yourself, not something you wait to happen after death. So, let's think about it. If Jesus spent years immersed in the teachings of Buddhism, it would make perfect sense that those philosophies would influence his own message when he returned to Judea. And we're not just talking about a casual influence. This is deep, foundational stuff. The kind of knowledge that would have fundamentally shaped who he was as a teacher, as a leader. But here's the thing, this isn't something you'll hear in Sunday school. The idea that Jesus' teachings could be influenced by another religion, especially one from the East, goes against centuries of established doctrine. But once you start connecting the dots, it's hard to ignore the similarities. It almost feels like we've been looking at two separate pieces of the same puzzle for thousands of years without realizing they're part of a bigger picture. What if Jesus wasn't just the son of a carpenter who had a few years of divine inspiration? What if he was a seeker of wisdom, a student of global spiritual traditions? And what if his time in India, learning from Buddhist monks, gave him the tools he needed to reshape the spiritual landscape of the West? Okay, now let's dive into something that's going to take this mystery to a whole new level, ancient Indian texts that might actually reference Jesus. One of the most interesting sources? The Bhavishya Purana. This is a lesser-known Hindu scripture that talks about events supposedly set to happen in the future. Now, this is where it gets weird. In one passage, the Bhavishya Purana describes a king meeting a foreign prophet from a distant land. This prophet's name? You guessed it, Isa or Ishamazi. The text even describes him as a man of fair skin, traveling from the west, preaching about the true God, and telling people to abandon idol worship. Does this sound familiar? It should, because it lines up suspiciously well with the Jesus we know from the Gospels. And here's the kicker: the Bhavishya Purana was written long before European missionaries arrived in India, so this can't just be some story cooked up later to align with Christianity. This is a standalone text in Hinduism that talks about a mysterious figure who could very well be Jesus. Now, skeptics will say that this passage was either mistranslated or it's just coincidental. Maybe the figure in the text was just another wandering ascetic, one of the many sages or prophets India has produced over the centuries. But when you look at the details, preaching about a single, all-powerful God, criticizing idol worship, it's hard not to see the parallels with Jesus' message. And we're not just talking about some vague resemblance here. The name Isa is the actual term many Eastern cultures use to refer to Jesus to this day. And it doesn't stop there. In the regions of Kashmir and Ladakh, there are local oral traditions that talk about a man named Isa who visited the region long ago. He was said to have been a teacher and healer, someone who performed miracles and preached about compassion, forgiveness, and the oneness of humanity. Again, this all lines up with the teachings we associate with Jesus. But why would these stories exist in the first place? Why would a Hindu text like the Bhavishya Purana or local legends in Kashmir mention a figure like Jesus if he never actually traveled there? It's not like ancient India had any real connection to the Middle East at that time. There was no reason for them to invent a story about a man like Isa unless there was some truth to it. Let's take a step back for a second. If Jesus did, in fact, travel to India, and if these Vedic texts and legends are true, that means his influence wasn't just limited to the West. It means he had a footprint in the East, too. And that's a big deal. It means that Jesus might have been one of the few figures in history whose teachings transcended borders in a way we've never fully understood. Of course, this is exactly the kind of story that messes with traditional narratives. For centuries, the idea of Jesus having any connection to Eastern religions has been shut down or dismissed. But now, as more scholars and researchers are looking at these ancient texts, the pieces are starting to come together. And while we don't have definitive proof, it's enough to make you wonder, how much of the story of Jesus have we not been told? Alright, we've hit the point where things go from fascinating to downright chilling. There's a theory out there, one that has been floating around for centuries, that Jesus didn't just survive the crucifixion, but that he ended up living out the rest of his days in Kashmir. Yeah, you heard that right. Kashmir, as in northern India. And the craziest part? There's a tomb that locals believe is where Jesus, known as Yusuf, is actually buried. In the heart of Srinagar, the summer capital of Kashmir, there's an ancient shrine called Rosable. Now, this isn't just any old tomb. For centuries, the people of this region have believed that a holy man named Yusuf, who some claim was actually Jesus, was buried here. The name Yusuf, according to local tradition, refers to a prophet who came from the West, lived among the people, and died in this very spot. And get this, it's not just a vague, blurry legend. There are records, dating back hundreds of years, that describe Yusuf's life and teachings in Kashmir, and they're eerily similar to what we know about Jesus. The Rosable shrine is small, humble even, nothing like the grand cathedrals or churches you might expect. But it has an aura of mystery that draws people from all over the world. The tomb bears markings that have led some to believe it belongs to someone of great spiritual significance. What's even more intriguing is the way the body inside is positioned. Unlike most burials in the region, which are done in the Islamic tradition with the body facing Mecca, the figure inside the Rosable tomb is laid out in a way that aligns with Jewish burial customs. Think about that for a second. Why would a tomb in India have a burial done in the style of ancient Jews unless it was someone from that tradition? Now, locals will tell you stories about Yusuf. They say he was a teacher, a healer, someone who preached about love, peace, and equality, basically the same stuff Jesus was all about. And here's the real kicker: Yusuf's teachings are said to have attracted large crowds, and many of the people in Kashmir revere him to this day. Sound familiar? It's almost like we're hearing the second half of a story that started all the way back in Judea. There are some historians and researchers who believe that after surviving the crucifixion, Jesus didn't ascend to heaven but instead traveled east, eventually settling in Kashmir, where he lived out his days as Yusuf. They argue that Jesus may have been nursed back to health by his followers and, to avoid the Roman authorities who wanted him dead, made the long journey to India, where he continued his mission in secret. And if you think this is just some modern internet conspiracy, think again. This theory has deep roots. In fact, Islamic texts, particularly in the Ahmadiyya Muslim tradition, have long supported the idea that Jesus lived in India and died a natural death there. According to these accounts, Jesus, or Isa as he's called in the Quran, didn't die on the cross. Instead, he survived and traveled east to preach to the lost tribes of Israel, who had settled in parts of Afghanistan and northern India. The tomb at Rosable, they say, is where he was finally laid to rest after a long life of teaching. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why isn't this a bigger deal? Why isn't this headline news? Well, the truth is, this theory shakes the very foundations of Christian doctrine. If Jesus didn't die on the cross and ascend to heaven, but instead lived out his days in India, it changes everything we thought we knew about the resurrection and the very nature of his divinity. It's no wonder the Rosable tomb remains a controversial topic, with some eager to dig deeper and others determined to keep the lid on this ancient mystery. There have been attempts to study the tomb more closely, including DNA testing, but every time researchers get close, something happens to shut it down. Whether it's government interference, religious opposition, or just plain bad luck, the tomb seems to remain one of history's most tantalizingly unsolved mysteries. Alright, so we've explored Jesus' potential journey to India, but let's dive into something that might blow your mind even more, the possibility that Buddhist monks played a role in shaping early Christianity. Around the time Jesus is believed to have lived, Buddhism had already been thriving for about 500 years. It had spread from India into Central Asia, reaching places like Afghanistan and even parts of the Middle East through trade routes like the Silk Road. So the idea that Buddhist teachings could have made their way to the region where Jesus lived isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. In fact, there's archaeological evidence that Buddhist communities existed in places like Alexandria, Egypt, just a stone's throw from the Mediterranean world Jesus was a part of. Some scholars believe that these Buddhist ideas didn't just influence random people in the region, but that they may have shaped the way Jesus and his followers saw the world. And not in some superficial way either. We're talking about foundational principles of compassion, selflessness, and inner peace that might have come from Buddhist teachings. Think about it. Jesus preached about turning the other cheek, loving your enemies, renouncing wealth, and finding the kingdom of God within you. Those aren't ideas you'd typically find in the Jewish tradition of his time. But they're almost identical to key concepts in Buddhism. Buddha taught that inner transformation, compassion for all living beings, and detaching from worldly possessions were the path to enlightenment. Sound familiar? Some historians suggest that Jesus wasn't just exposed to Buddhist ideas, he may have actually learned from Buddhist monks themselves. According to some accounts, Buddhist missionaries traveled westward, bringing their teachings to the ancient world, including the Mediterranean region. It's possible that Jesus, or at least some of his followers, encountered these Buddhist monks and integrated their teachings into what would later become Christianity. Let's look at the Sermon on the Mount. Many people consider it to be the heart of Jesus' teachings. But when you break it down, it mirrors Buddhist philosophy almost too closely to ignore. Jesus says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Now compare that with the Buddhist idea that humility and detachment from ego lead to enlightenment. Jesus talks about blessed are the pure in heart, and Buddhists teach about the importance of purifying the mind to free oneself from suffering. It's not just that they're both advocating for compassion or kindness, it's that they're coming from the same philosophical foundation. And what about the idea of renouncing materialism? Jesus made it clear that wealth wasn't the path to salvation. He even said that it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. This is almost identical to Buddha's teachings about detachment from material possessions leading to true happiness and enlightenment. But here's the part that makes you question everything. Could early Christian monks, like the Desert Fathers who lived in ascetic isolation, have been inspired by Buddhist monks living in monasteries? I mean, these Christian ascetics renounced the world, lived in the wilderness, meditated, fasted, and devoted their lives to spiritual discipline, just like Buddhist monks had been doing for centuries before. It gets deeper. There's even speculation that the early Christian concept of monasticism, where people leave society to live a life of prayer and contemplation, might have roots in the Buddhist monk tradition. The timing lines up. Buddhism had monastic orders by the 5th century BCE, and monasticism didn't become a major part of Christianity until a few hundred years after Jesus. Could those early Christians have been modeling their practices after the Buddhists they encountered along the trade routes? And before anyone dismisses this as pure speculation, let's not forget that the Roman Empire had significant trade with India and Asia. There were cultural exchanges happening all the time. So it's not only possible, but likely, that ideas from Buddhism found their way into the spiritual landscape of the early Christian world. Now, what does all of this mean? It's simple. The boundaries between religions might not be as solid as we think. If Jesus was influenced by Buddhist teachings, or if his early followers were shaped by them, then Christianity as we know it might be more connected to the East than anyone realized. It challenges the idea that Christianity developed in isolation, showing that perhaps it was part of a larger, global conversation about spirituality, enlightenment, and the nature of the divine. And with that, we come to the end of this deep dive into the lost years of Jesus. Whether you're convinced that Jesus traveled to India or you think it's all just a great story, one thing's for sure: the life of Jesus continues to inspire curiosity, debate, and a desire for understanding, even 2,000 years later. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. We really appreciate you taking the time to explore these ideas with us. If this video sparked your interest, hit that like button, drop a comment below with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. Your support means everything, so thanks again, and we'll see you in the next one.